A young billionaire hired a nanny for his son, but he'd never expect to fall in love with her. Sophia Harper clutched the strap of her weathered bag as she stood before the towering gates of the Blackwood estate. The wrought iron stretched high above her, intricate and unyielding, a perfect metaphor for the fortress of wealth she was about to step into. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed the intercom button, her reflection distorted in the sleek black panel. She had nothing left to lose. "State your name and purpose," a clipped, icy voice commanded through the speaker. Sophia. "Harper. I'm here for the nanny position," she said, trying to sound confident. Her voice wavered anyway. She could almost feel the judgment through the intercom. The gates groaned as they opened, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly pruned trees and a sprawling mansion that seemed to glisten beneath the early afternoon sun. The place was a work of art, its massive glass walls reflecting the pristine blue sky. But it felt cold, like the kind of house designed to impress rather than to live in. Sophia swallowed hard and forced herself to walk forward. By the time she reached the massive double doors, they were already swinging open. A tall woman in a sharp black suit stood there, her expression as unyielding as the gates. "I'm Margaret, Mr. Blackwood's assistant. I'll warn you now, he doesn't tolerate incompetence. If you're not up to his standards, you won't last a week." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. I'll do my best." Margaret gave her a look that said, "We'll see," and motioned her inside. The entryway was breathtaking, with a grand staircase spiraling upward, and a chandelier that looked like it cost more than Sophia's entire life. She tried not to gape as Margaret led her through the house, her flats squeaking faintly against the marble floors. "Wait here," Margaret instructed as they reached a set of double doors. She disappeared inside, leaving Sophia alone in the hallway. Her palms were damp, and she wiped them on her skirt, mentally rehearsing her answers to potential questions. When the doors opened again, Margaret's voice called out, "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." Sophia stepped inside, and there he was. Victor Blackwood. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, the sunlight casting a sharp outline of his tall, broad frame. When he turned, her stomach flipped. He was devastatingly handsome, with chiseled features, piercing gray eyes, and an impeccably tailored suit that screamed wealth. But his expression was cold, almost detached, as if she were an inconvenience he was forced to endure. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Let's get this over with." Sophia lifted her chin, determined not to let him intimidate her. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Blackwood." He gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Sit." She obeyed, her back straight as she met his gaze. His eyes flicked over her, assessing, but his expression gave nothing away. "I'll be blunt," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've gone through 6 nannies in the past year. None of them lasted more than a month. My son is difficult. If you're looking for an easy job, you're in the wrong place." Sophia's hands clenched in her lap. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for meaningful." His brow lifted slightly, the first sign of interest. "Meaningful, you say?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Your son doesn't need perfection, Mr. Blackwood. He needs someone who actually cares." A flicker of something, surprise maybe, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door burst open and a small boy peeked inside. "Jamie," Victor said sharply, his tone softening only slightly. "What did I tell you about interrupting?" The boy flinched but didn't retreat. He was 5, maybe 6, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and wide, solemn eyes that reminded Sophia of a stormy sea. He clutched a small stuffed dinosaur to his chest, his gaze darting nervously between his father and Sophia. "It's okay," Sophia said gently before Victor could say more. She crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to Jamie's eye level. "Hi, Jamie. I'm Sophia." Jamie didn't say anything, but his grip on the dinosaur loosened slightly. "Is that a T-Rex?" she asked, pointing to the toy. "He looks pretty strong. Does he have a name?" Jamie hesitated, then whispered, "Rexy. Rexy," she repeated with a warm smile. "That's a great name. I bet he's really brave." The faintest hint of a smile tugged at Jamie's lips, and Victor's sharp gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he watched. "Jamie," Victor said after a moment, his voice gentler now. "Go back to your room. I'll be there soon." Jamie nodded and retreated, but not before casting one last curious glance at Sophia. When the door clicked shut, the room felt heavier. Victor studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He hasn't smiled like that in months. Sophia's chest tightened at the weight in his voice. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "I can't imagine what you've both been through." His jaw tightened, and he looked away as if the words were too much to bear. "This is only a trial," he said abruptly, his tone regaining its earlier edge. "Don't expect any gratitude when you inevitably quit." Sophia rose to her feet, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "I'm not a quitter, Mr. Blackwood. I'll prove that to you." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. "Margaret will show you to the guest quarters. You start tomorrow." As Sophia followed Margaret out of the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into a lion's den. But when she thought of Jamie's shy smile, she knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever it took, she would be there for him, even if his father made her job a living nightmare. The next morning, Sophia stood in the doorway of Jamie's room, taking in her new surroundings. The walls were painted a deep navy, dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars. Shelves lined with books and dinosaur figurines hinted at a boy who loved to escape into other worlds. But the bed, with its perfectly tucked comforter and untouched pillows, looked almost sterile. It was the kind of room designed for a child, but devoid of the clutter and chaos that came with one actually living in it. Jamie sat cross-legged on the carpet, his back to her, carefully arranging toy dinosaurs into what looked like a battle formation. He hadn't noticed her yet. "Good morning, Jamie," Sophia said softly, not wanting to startle him. He froze, his small shoulders stiffening. Slowly, he turned his head to look at her, his expression guarded. Rexy, the stuffed dinosaur, was clutched tightly in his lap. "I thought we could read a story together," Sophia offered, holding up a book she'd found on one of his shelves. It was about a brave little boy who befriended a dragon. "Unless you're busy planning a dinosaur adventure." Jamie hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and the book. Then, without a word, he scooted over, leaving just enough space for her to sit beside him. It wasn't an invitation exactly, but it wasn't a rejection either. Sophia lowered herself onto the carpet, careful not to crowd him. She opened the book and began reading, her voice light and animated. As the story unfolded, she noticed Jamie, inching closer, his body relaxing bit by bit. By the time they reached the part where the boy and the dragon saved the day, he was leaning against her arm, completely engrossed. When she closed the book, Jamie looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Will you stay forever?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's heart clenched. She wanted to say yes, to promise him stability and comfort, but she knew it wasn't a promise she could make. "I'll stay as long as I can," she said gently. "How about we take it one day at a time?" Jamie nodded, seeming to accept her answer. He handed her Rexy. "You can hold him. He's brave." Sophia smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jamie. I think we'll make a pretty good team." Victor Blackwood stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something had drawn him there. Maybe it was the sound of Jamie's soft voice, so rarely heard these days. Or maybe it was the way Sophia seemed to bring a warmth to the room that had been missing for far too long. He didn't like how she made him feel. Vulnerable. Exposed. It was easier to keep people at a distance, to focus on running his empire and ensuring Jamie had everything he could ever need. Materially, at least. But seeing his son lean into her, trust her, stirred something deep and uncomfortable within him. When Sophia glanced over and caught him watching, he stepped into the room, his expression carefully neutral. "Jamie, it's time for breakfast," he said, his tone brisk. Jamie scrambled to his feet, clutching Rexy. "Can Sophia come too?" Victor hesitated, but Jamie's hopeful expression left him with little choice. "If she wants," he said, gruffly. Sophia rose gracefully, her smile polite but guarded. "I'd be happy to." The dining room was as intimidating as the rest of the mansion. A massive mahogany table stretched endlessly, flanked by high-backed chairs and set with fine china and crystal glasses. It was the kind of room meant for hosting lavish dinner parties, not casual family meals. Jamie climbed into his seat, swinging his legs as he munched on a piece of toast. Sophia sat beside him, feeling small in the cavernous space. Victor took his usual seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he sipped his coffee. "Jamie seems to be warming up to you," Victor said suddenly, breaking the silence. Sophia looked up, surprised by the comment. "He's a wonderful boy. He just needs someone to listen." Victor's gaze hardened. Listening is one thing, overstepping is another. Sophia frowned, unsure where the accusation was coming from. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Victor said, his voice sharp, "that encouraging him to talk about his mother is not your place." Sophia's chest tightened. "He brought her up on his own, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't push him. I just let him talk." Victor's jaw clenched, his grip on his coffee cup tightening. Jamie doesn't need to be reminded of things he can't change. He needs to move forward. "With all due respect, that's not how grief works," Sophia said, her voice steady but firm. "You can't force it to go away by ignoring it." Victor's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too. Pain. "And you're an expert on grief, are you?" Sophia hesitated, the air between them crackling with tension. "I lost my parents when I was Jamie's age," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to feel alone in it." Victor froze, the anger draining from his face. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "I didn't know that." "You didn't ask," she said softly. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of Jamie humming to himself as he buttered another piece of toast. Victor looked away, his jaw tightening again, but he didn't say another word. Later that evening, Victor found himself lingering outside the living room, drawn once again by the sound of Sophia's voice. She was sitting on the floor with Jamie, helping him build a dinosaur out of colorful blocks. Her laughter filled the room, light and genuine, and Victor felt something twist in his chest. He walked away before she could see him. The next day, Sophia decided to take Jamie to the park. He needed fresh air, and she thought the change of scenery might do him good. They spent hours exploring the playground, feeding ducks at the small lake, and building a castle out of sticks and leaves. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jamie laughed. A real, uninhibited laugh that made Sophia's heart soar. But their idyllic afternoon was shattered when a camera flashed. Sophia turned sharply, spotting a man with a telephoto lens. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed Jamie's hand and hurried back to the car, her mind racing with the implications. That evening, Victor stormed into the living room, his face like thunder. He tossed a tabloid onto the coffee table. The headline screamed, "Billionaire Blackwood's mystery nanny, new love or just a convenient scandal?" Sophia's face burned as she saw the photo of her and Jamie at the park, her hand on his shoulder. "I didn't know someone was watching," she said, her voice shaking. "I would never what?" Victor snapped. "Exploit my son? Use him for attention?" Sophia shot to her feet, her eyes blazing. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm some kind of opportunist?" "I don't know what to think," Victor admitted, his voice low but cold. "People are rarely what they seem." Sophia's heart cracked at the accusation. "I've done nothing but care for Jamie," she said, her voice trembling. "If you can't see that, then maybe I don't belong here." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the room, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. Victor stared after her, the tabloid burning a hole in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't ignore: regret. Victor sat alone in his study, the tabloid crumpled in his hand. The mansion was silent, save for the faint hum of the night wind brushing against the glass walls. He stared at the photo on the front page. Sophia kneeling beside Jamie, her smile radiant, his son's face lit with a joy Victor hadn't seen in years. He had been wrong. The weight of the accusation he'd hurled at her pressed heavily on his chest. He lashed out, not because he believed she was exploiting Jamie, but because the sight of his son laughing, bonding, terrified him. It threatened the walls Victor had built around his heart, and in his fear, he'd pushed her away. Again. With a deep breath, Victor rose from his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He wasn't a man who apologized often, but tonight, he had no choice. Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, her suitcase open but still empty. She had told herself she would leave tonight, but her hands wouldn't move to pack. The thought of walking away from Jamie, from the bond they'd built, left her hollow. And yet, staying meant enduring Victor's cold judgment, his inability to trust. She couldn't win. A soft knock at the door startled her. She wiped at her damp cheeks, straightened her shoulders, and opened it, only to find Victor standing there, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. He held the tabloid in one hand, his other shoved into the pocket of his suit pants. "Sophia," he began, his voice low, "I need to apologize." Her lips parted in surprise, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I shouldn't have accused you of exploiting Jamie," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I know you'd never do that. I let my own fears cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process. I'm sorry." Sophia crossed her arms, her heart warring with her pride. "You don't trust me, Victor. How am I supposed to stay here when you see me as some kind of threat?" His jaw tightened, but instead of retreating, he stepped closer. "You're not a threat. You're the opposite of that. You've done more for Jamie in a few weeks than I have in years, and that terrifies me." Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "Why? Because I can't lose him," Victor said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've already lost too much, and if I let myself rely on you, if Jamie relies on you, and you leave..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor as if the words were too heavy to speak. Sophia's anger softened, replaced by a wave of empathy. She understood his fear more than she wanted to admit. "I care about Jamie," she said quietly. "And I care about you too. But if you keep pushing people away, you'll end up alone, Victor." He looked up at her then, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. "I don't want to be alone." The vulnerability in his voice unraveled her resolve. "Then let me stay. Trust me." Victor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Okay." 2 days later, Victor surprised Sophia and Jamie by announcing they'd be taking a trip to his private beach house. Jamie's eyes lit up at the mention of the ocean, and Sophia couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. The tension between her and Victor had eased since their late-night conversation, but there was an undercurrent of something else now. something unspoken but palpable in the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The beach house was everything Sophia had expected and more. Perched on a secluded stretch of coastline, the glass-walled structure seemed to merge with the ocean itself. Inside, the decor was surprisingly warm, with plush furniture, soft throws, and walls lined with books. It felt more like a sanctuary than a display of wealth. Jamie wasted no time running to the shoreline, his laughter ringing out as he chased the waves. Sophia followed, her feet sinking into the warm sand as she watched him. Victor stood a few paces behind her, his hands in his pockets, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "He's happy here," Sophia said, breaking the silence. Victor nodded. "It's the first place I brought him after his mother passed. I thought it would help, but I didn't know how to reach him." Sophia turned to face him, her heart aching at the weight in his voice. "You're reaching him now." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Because of you." Her breath hitched as the space between them seemed to shrink. For a moment it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them, the ocean a distant hum. His hand lifted slightly, as if he was about to touch her, but before he could, Jamie's voice broke the spell. "Come build a sandcastle with me," he shouted, waving wildly from the shore. Sophia laughed, a little breathless. "We'd better go before he starts without us." Victor smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and followed her to the water. That evening, they built a bonfire on the sand. Jamie fell asleep, curled up in a blanket, Rexy tucked under his arm. Sophia and Victor sat side by side, the firelight casting flickering shadows across their faces. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Victor nodded. "Anything. What happened with your mother? I can tell it's complicated." He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "She left when I was 8. Said she couldn't handle the pressure of raising a kid on her own. She came back into my life when I became successful, but only when it suited her. I learned not to expect anything from her." Sophia's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry, Victor. No child should have to go through that." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's why I'm so protective of Jamie. I don't want him to feel that kind of loss. Ever." "You're a good father," she said firmly. "Even if you don't always believe it." His eyes softened, and for a moment, she thought he might say something. But the sound of a car pulling up the driveway interrupted them. Victor's expression darkened. "Stay here," he said, rising to his feet. Sophia watched as he strode toward the house. A few minutes later, she heard raised voices, curious and concerned. She followed, stopping just outside the front door. "Why are you here?" "Mother?" Victor's voice was sharp, laced with anger. "I came to meet the woman you've led into my grandson's life," a cold, feminine voice replied. "Don't you think I have a right to know who she is?" Sophia stepped inside, her heart pounding. A tall, elegant woman with icy blue eyes and perfectly styled silver hair turned to face her, a thin smile curving her lips. "And you must be the nanny," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Tell me, dear, what's your angle?" Sophia flushed, her fists clenching at her sides. "I don't have an angle." "Mother, that's enough," Victor snapped, stepping between them. "Sophia's here because she cares about Jamie. That's all you need to know." His mother arched a brow. "You've always been too trusting, Victor. Don't let her fool you." Sophia's eyes stung, but she refused to let the woman see her cry. "I think I'll go check on Jamie," she said tightly, turning on her, heel before anyone could stop her. Later that night, Victor found her in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed with her suitcase open once again. Sophia, he began, but she cut him off. I can't do this, Victor, she said, her voice trembling. I thought you saw me for who I am, not who people say I am. But I was wrong. You're not wrong, he said desperately, stepping closer. I don't believe her, Sophia. Stop, she said, shaking her head. This isn't about what you believe. It's about what I deserve. And I deserve better than this. Victor's heart sank as she zipped her suitcase, her movements quick and determined. Sophia, please. But she was already out the door. Sophia? Adjusted the microphone on the small wooden podium of the cozy independent bookstore, her fingers trembling slightly. The space was warm and inviting, with shelves overflowing with books and a faint smell of coffee drifting from the cafe corner. A modest group of children sat cross-legged on a woven rug in front of her, their eager eyes on the hardcover book in her hands. Behind them, parents and a few curious patrons looked on with polite smiles. She took a deep breath and opened the book. The colorful illustrations of Rexy's big adventure stared back at her, a story she had poured her heart into during sleepless nights after leaving the Blackwood estate. It was her first self-published children's book, inspired by Jamie and his beloved stuffed dinosaur. She had hoped that chasing her dream would help her heal, but the ache of leaving Jamie and Victor refused to fade. Sophia began to read, her voice soft but steady. The children giggled at Rexy's antics, and a few parents nodded approvingly at the story's heartfelt message about finding courage even when you feel small. She smiled, allowing herself a moment of pride. This was the life she had dreamed of, wasn't it? But why did it still feel incomplete? As she turned the page, a ripple of whispers broke out in the back of the room. She glanced up, her voice faltering, and her heart stopped. Victor. He stood near the entrance, his tall frame unmistakable even in the sea of bookshelves. He wasn't alone. Jamie was at his side, clutching Rexy and grinning ear to ear. For a moment, Sophia thought she must be dreaming. But then Victor's steely gray eyes met hers, and the intensity in his gaze told her this was no dream. She fumbled to finish the story, her words stumbling over the final lines. The children clapped enthusiastically, oblivious to her inner turmoil, and she managed a weak smile as she closed the book. An older woman who owned the store stepped forward to thank her, but Sophia barely heard her. Her focus was locked on Victor as he began to walk toward her, Jamie trailing behind him. Before she could process what was happening, Victor reached the podium and turned to face the small crowd, his presence commanding the room. He held up a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Excuse me, everyone," he said, his deep voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'd like to take a moment to say something." Sophia's heart raced. "Victor, what are you—" "Please, let me finish," he interrupted gently, his eyes locking onto hers. "I owe you this." He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You might not know me, but my name is Victor Blackwood, and I'm here today because of this remarkable woman standing beside me. Sophia Harper is more than just an author. She's the reason my son smiles again. She's the reason I've learned what it means to truly live." Sophia's breath hitched, her eyes wide as whispers rippled through the audience. "I was afraid," Victor continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Afraid of letting someone in. Afraid of losing again. But losing Sophia is my greatest regret. She taught me that love isn't about control or protection. It's about trust. And I broke that trust. But I'm here now, hoping I can earn it back." Sophia's eyes filled with tears as Victor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp stack of books. Her books. "I bought every copy of Rexy's Big Adventure in this store," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Not because I'm a billionaire, but because I believe in you, Sophia. I believe in your dreams and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that." The crowd broke into applause, but Sophia barely heard it. Her tears spilled over as Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I love you, Sophia. You and Jamie were the family I never dared to dream of. Please come back." Jamie tugged on her sleeve, his small voice breaking through her overwhelmed thoughts. "Please, Sophia. Rexy misses you. I miss you." Sophia dropped to her knees, wrapping Jamie in a fierce hug as her tears dampened his hair. "I missed you, too," she whispered, her voice trembling. When she finally looked up, Victor was holding out a large leather-bound book. Her breath caught as she opened it and saw the pages were filled with Jamie's illustrations. Bright, colorful depictions of Rexy and his adventures, perfectly paired with her words. "Jamie wanted to help," Victor said softly. "He worked on this every night after you left. We had it printed as a gift, but it's more than that. It's a promise that you'll never have to face your dreams alone." Sophia's hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her. "Victor, I don't know what to say. Say you'll come home," he said, his voice breaking. "Not as Jamie's nanny, but as part of our family." Her heart swelled with a love so fierce it threatened to consume her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Victor." He pulled her to her feet, cupping her face as their lips met in a passionate, tearful kiss. The crowd erupted into cheers, but all she could feel was the warmth of Victor's embrace and the promise of the life they were about to build. The Blackwood mansion had never looked so alive. The gardens were transformed into a wonderland of flowers and lights for the wedding. Jamie darted between guests, proudly wearing his suit and carrying the rings in a small velvet box. Rexy peeked out of his pocket, a silent witness to the day's joy. Sophia stood at the altar, her dress flowing like a dream, as Victor took her hands in his. His eyes shone with love and gratitude as he spoke his vows. "You are my heart, Sophia. You and Jamie are my everything." When Jamie stepped forward to hand them the rings, he looked up at Sophia and whispered, "I love you, Mom." Her tears flowed freely as she pulled him close, her heart finally whole. As Victor kissed her with the sun setting behind them, Sophia knew she'd found her forever, their family,